And then they beat him and beat him some more. They put a robe upon his back, and there he stood with that crown of thorns upon his head. And they mocked him some more. His face was swollen now beyond recognition. I remember many years ago, there was a young man that was in a car accident, and in this car accident, he had hit his head extremely hard on one of the instruments or something inside the car. It totally knocked him out. He had a severe concussion and did brain damage. And I'll never forget going there and looking at him in the hospital. His face had literally swollen almost as large as a basketball. It had swollen so much that his ears had turned almost inside out, and his eyes were closed, and yet they were bugging. They were coming out from behind the eyelids. It was the most horrible sight that I think I've ever seen. And if you can get a picture of that, then understand that Jesus wasn't hit just once. He wasn't just hit by a fist of men, but he was hit with clubs and beaten until he was almost beaten unconsciously. And his face was swollen so badly that his eyes were almost closed because of the swelling of the face. He was a horrible sight to look upon. And yet, he did all of that for you and for me. Because that's how we were supposed to have received our reward for sin. He took our place, and he died for you, and he died for me. And so there he stands with his body all covered with blood, his back bleeding, and great chunks of meat where they had taken a cat of 9 tails. And on each end of that cat of 9 tails, a whip, there was broken pottery. There was pieces of rock and so forth. Anything they could find sharp that would tear into the skin they used. And 39 stripes they put up on his back. When they would hit with this whip, they would jerk it, and when they jerked it, it went into the skin and literally pulled the meat away from the bone itself. He is standing there in this kind of condition. And the crowd is yelling, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" He's a rabble-rouser. We don't need his kind. He stirred up the people. Get rid of him. Crucify him. We don't want him. We don't care about him. The world has that attitude today. They don't want him. The world doesn't want him. Do you realize of all of the religions in the world today, of all of the religions, Christianity is the most hated of all the religions. It's amazing that this man did nothing but good for his people, good for every nation, every person in this world. And he and his work and his followers are so hated. And so they took him after being turned over to the religious crowd by Pilate, which incidentally heard the mock trial and what they had to say, and said, "You know, in listening to what you have to say, I absolutely find no fault in this man." But then he said, "You do with him what you want to do with him." And they took him out of Pilate's hall and led him outside where they had constructed a cross, an old, jagged, hateful looking cross. And there they compelled him to pick his own cross up and carry it to Calvary. Falling beneath the cross from the weight, loss of blood, he carried it, suffering every step. The pain was beyond explanation. It was so horrible. And yet he went on and carried the cross. Anytime he could have quit, he could have stopped on the spot and said, it's enough, this thing's went far enough. Father, call me back home. And he could have left, but he didn't do it. He went on in spite of the pain, in spite of all they could do to him, because God so loved the world. Because he loved you and because he loved me. And this was the only way that man could be saved from their sins, was the death of the spotless Son of God. They got him to Calvary and they lay him up on a cross, and there they took 3 old nails, spikes. I'm not talking about little 10-penny nails. I'm talking about spikes like that, and as large as your index finger. And they drove it in the wrist of Jesus, and they drove it in his feet, and they took that cross and they stood it up into a hole and let it down, and it hit the bottom of that hole, and flesh tore from his wrist and his feet. And now he is hanging between earth and heaven. He's dying. 6 long hours he would be held there, ridiculed and mocked. It was at this time that his pain and suffering became so intense and so great that God himself, the Father, turned his back to keep from looking upon his Son. Jesus yelled with a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, that meant, my God, why have you forsaken me? And all along there at Calvary, he suffered. And finally, he said, it's finished. And he dropped his head and he died. And the thunderings came, and the day got dark, and there in the midst of all that hung Jesus, the Son of God. And they said, he's dead. We won't have to worry about him anymore. He's dead. We won't have to put up with all of his shenanigans. He is dead.